Welcome to Common Space, a conversation among friends who happen to be United Methodist pastors. My name is Chris Estes.
Hi, Chris. I'm Daryl.
Hi, Daryl.
Hi, Chris. I'm Ryan.
Hi, Ryan. So glad you guys are here. And this week we're going to talk about the book of Leviticus, which for many people is the place where the Bible reading plan quietly comes to an end. It can feel repetitive, detailed, and honestly a little strange to modern readers. There are sacrifices, purity laws, instructions about fat and blood and offerings, things that don't immediately feel connected to everyday spiritual life for most of us.
Like the long lobe of the liver.
Yes. But what if Leviticus isn't primitive religion that we simply outgrew? What if it was actually a revolutionary step forward in human consciousness about God? One of the ways we're going to approach Leviticus today is with a phrase we use a lot around Common Space, a phrase we've learned from people like Ken Wilber, Rob Bell, and Richard Rohr. And that phrase is transcend and include. The idea is that spiritual growth usually doesn't happen by rejecting what came before us. It happens by moving through earlier stages and carrying forward what still gives life. We don't throw the past away, we reinterpret it. We mature through it. So Ryan, before we get too deeply in this, where is the book of Leviticus anyway?
The book of Leviticus is the third book of the Torah. And the Torah are the first 5 books that we find when we pick up the Bible and open up the front cover. It's the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Traditionally, we call these the books of Moses, but the compilation of the Torah is a little bit more complicated than that. And we've done a little bit of talk about that in other episodes, so we won't go too deep into it now. But an important thing to note about the book of Leviticus is that it is the central book of the Torah. And so there is kind of this triad form of the Torah in that Genesis and Deuteronomy are kind of the bookends of the Torah. And then what is in between those, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, kind of form the central core of what Torah is about. And then Leviticus is the central part of that central core, and there's a particular part of Leviticus that is the most central part of Torah. And so Leviticus, even though it's something that we rarely talk about in our Christian churches and something that we rarely kind of pick up and decide that we want to study, it plays a really central role in the life of faith of our Jewish brothers and sisters. It plays a central role in the life of faith of Jesus, and a lot of what Jesus does, a lot of what Jesus says can be directly tied back to the book of Leviticus. So Leviticus is an early book in the Bible, and even if it's not something you explore too often, it's something that is very important.
So Ryan, if Leviticus is central to the Torah, how did we get to it, and how does it relate to that which is before it and after it?
So a really helpful way to think about Torah is to think about the overarching narrative of the entire Torah. Oftentimes you'll see Torah translated as the word law. And when you encounter the word law in the writings of Paul, or even when Jesus says it in the New Testaments, the concept behind that word law is the Jewish Torah. And Torah contains laws, but Torah itself is not a collection of laws. Torah is a narrative. Torah is a narrative that starts in a particular place and finishes in a particular place. And the laws of Torah are an important part of Torah, but the laws are not the central thing about Torah. And so the narrative of Torah that we're kind of lining up with is that in the beginning, God created something beautiful. And then God asked humanity to be stewards of this beautiful thing, and we kind of ducked that up. And so humanity is cast out of the beginning setting of Genesis in those very first chapters. Humanity is cast out, exiled from Eden. And the rest of the story of Torah is talking about kind of the results of what happened in that moment. And it recapitulates that story. It retells that story over and over and over again through human mishap. And so by the time we get to Leviticus, the people of Israel had been enslaved and had been freed. And at the end of the book of Exodus, they have been given instructions on how to construct a tabernacle, a tent where God would dwell with them. And then they completed that tent. And when we pick up Leviticus, the story is God is coming to dwell with the people. And so the question Leviticus asks is, if God is coming near to us, what is it that we must do to receive this presence? How do we need to prepare ourselves for the presence of God? How do we need to prepare the places that we're in to receive the presence of God? And when we receive that presence of God, then how do we respond to it?
So, Daryl, the word korban, I believe that means offering,
It's translated that way.
but it's also translated to draw near.
Correct.
So that feels like a huge shift in how people approach the divine.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the consciousness of the time, it was a pretty standard idea to think the gods are unapproachable. They may be angry, they may be too holy, they may be somewhere else and composed of something else, and you're not worthy, that kind of stuff. So this book starts off with the usage of that word korban in Leviticus 1:1, when it says, when you bring an offering to God. That offering, the Hebrew word behind offering, like you said, is korban, and that means to draw near. So right out of the gates, this book is saying you can draw near. You can get close. You can be in relationship with this God. So you're right, it's a fundamental shift.
So
in fact, listen to this first. This is the first couple of verses of Leviticus, and this is the Robert Alter translation. It says, "And he called Moses, and the Lord spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, should any person from you bring forward to the Lord an offering of beasts from herd and from flock, you shall bring forward your offering." And the way that the Hebrew sounds in that, because there's the korban of offering, but to bring something forward is also a play on korban. And so what it says in the Hebrew is like, when you want to bring your korban to korban, then korban. When you want to bring the thing that comes near before the thing that comes near, then bring the thing near.
That makes it very clear.
Doesn't it? Yes. So korban is both the offering and it's the things that's brought near. It's the bringing near of the things that are brought near to the one that's brought near. And so the whole story is about God is coming near to us. And so what is it that we are bringing near to God?
I love it.
frequently these offerings are referred to as sacrifices.
I love that less.
Yeah, exactly. And but it's really not about fixing something wrong. It's more about celebrating peace with God, isn't it?
Depends on which one you're talking about.
I think we need to go ahead and just name, like Chris said in the opening, that there are so many contextualized rules, instructions, commandments in Leviticus that cause so many problems for so many people. That's why you said, Chris, when you opened it, that people start reading the Bible and they commit to reading a chapter a day through the year, and then they get to Leviticus and it crashes. Because there's so many things that just are hard for us to understand, and some of them, to be honest, are just not helpful. Some of the things you're going to read in Leviticus are not helpful when they're decontextualized, when you try to take it from the page and apply it directly into your life. So we do have to do some deeper work. When you invite us to transcend and include, we have to look at these things and say, you know what, not everything in Leviticus is timeless. Right? Some of Leviticus is bound to the time in which it was written, and the place in which it was written, the culture in which it was written. And we have to be okay. That's a fundamental question. Can we be okay with parts of the Bible being timeless and parts of the Bible being time bound?
Ryan, there seems to be a lot of different things going on in this book of Leviticus. Does the structure itself tell us anything that we need to know?
Yeah, the structure of Leviticus really helps. So it opens up, as we said, with the bringing near of the things that are brought near to the one who is brought near. And what those things end up being are what sometimes we call sacrifices. And so for the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, you are reading all of those details that you mentioned in the opening about the fat of an animal and the long lobe of the liver and what pieces of meat go where and who gets what. And there are 5 different sacrifices that are described in the first 7 chapters. And it can be a little bit of a slog getting through them. But then you get through that first 7 chapters about those sacrifices, about those offerings, which really is a better word, of those things that are brought near. And you get a few chapters of a narrative of an example that can kind of continues to tell that story of how humanity continues to muck up the things that are brought near. And then post that narrative, then you get this list of expectations that God has for the priests. and what the priests need to do to prepare themselves to actually get near to God as they bring forth those offerings. And at the end of that long list of things for the priests, you have what we call the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is the central part of Leviticus. So the Day of Atonement is the central part of the central book of Torah. And then after that, once you've got the priests in their right state of mind, and you have the nation and the tent of meeting in the right state as well, you get into the list of commands that are considered kind of the everyday holiness code, the everyday list of things that people should be doing in their lives to maintain a state in which they can continue to welcome the presence of God in their life.
So Leviticus created structured ways for people to repair relationship with God themselves and with others, correct?
And the land. The land is a really important one in this one too.
At that time, didn't people feel like one mistake would bring down divine wrath? And to have instructions like this would actually have been reassuring, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the way that Leviticus portrays these offerings in particular, speaking of the offerings, is it says that the God of Israel gives the people these offerings in the sense that God has told them exactly what they need to do in order to maintain a right relationship with God and with each other and with the land. And God actually provides the things that they will then offer up as well. And the way that contrasts to the world around them is that there was so much anxiety on the part of the people that trying to appease the other gods. They never knew quite what was enough. You see this expressed in Micah. What is it that I'm supposed to give? Am I supposed to give, my grain, or maybe my livestock, or maybe, 1,000 livestock I've got on the hill? Should I offer up my son? And so that anxiety is built into the culture around them. And Leviticus, it's portrayed as this God says, stop worrying about it. I'm going to tell you what you can do, and this is how we're going to maintain this relationship. And you don't have to have the anxiety that everybody else has.
So it's actually creating clarity and stability and a pathway to peace, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, for people who are earlier on the path than we are. And I think that's the important thing, right? Like, it was a step forward, it was a progression. But when we pick it up now, it can seem like regression. It can seem like something that is archaic and detached from the understanding we have now. If we're very comfortable with the fact that we can draw near to God and God draws near to us, then some of these steps for drawing near seem like obstacles, and they don't seem like progress. They seem like barriers. And as you mentioned earlier, Chris, we start to see the Bible itself, the books of the Bible itself, come to that conclusion and start arguing with Leviticus, start arguing with Torah, and going even further than this step of progression.
These are questions that we have today, even. It's deeply human. Question of when something goes wrong, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
What if I did something that unintentionally caused harm? What do I do? What if my conscience won't settle down because of something that feels unresolved? Leviticus created structured ways for people to deal with those things.
In a specific time, in a specific culture, in a specific place, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when we rip that stuff and try to apply it here and now, rather than letting it speak to the narrative that Ryan was talking about earlier. Because the narrative, the overarching narrative of the Bible is convincingly, you are one with God and God is one with you. And try as you may to undo that reality, God will not relent and let you stay there. And so taking these rules and saying these are what qualifies you actually cuts against that narrative. These rules weren't what qualified the people. The rules were a grace-filled step for the people who needed that. And so if you need to believe that God needs a sacrifice, that God needs you to do this thing in this way at this time in this place to draw near, then God gives you that. But if you don't need that, God doesn't need it either. God draws near to you no matter what.
I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit trail or not, but you mentioned the book of Micah, which is by the prophet Micah, and he had questions. Now, Leviticus is recording something from early Hebrew history, allegedly. Micah is way later. Why does Micah have these questions? What is he seeing around him? Where is he that he's seeing things around him And when was Leviticus actually put together?
Okay, so that's an interesting question about the relationship between the prophets and especially the questions that Micah has and what's in the book of Leviticus. Because there is the narrative setting of Leviticus, but then there's also kind of the, I guess what you might call the compilative setting of Leviticus. Did I just make up a word? But there's the setting in which Leviticus came to be what it is. In the narrative, Leviticus is early in Israelite history. It's right after the Exodus narrative. It's a part of the desert wandering. It's actually a very short part of the desert wandering because all of this is really collapsed into very, very short amount of time, even though it's 27 chapters long. But the setting in which Leviticus came to be what it is a post-exilic setting. So when the people of Israel were sent into exile, those people had questions about why they're in exile, what they need to do to get out of exile, what they should do when they are out of exile, and how they should organize themselves for themselves not to be caught in exile yet again. Because again, the story of Torah is a story of exile. Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden because of the decisions that they made. And then you have the stories of Cain and Abel. And Abel and Cain both present offerings, which are very Levitical ideas. And one of those is an acceptable offering and the other is not. And the one that offers the unacceptable offering ends up exiled. And then throughout the Genesis, you keep getting these stories of little exiles. And then you have the major exile of the people in Egypt enslaved. They're just enslaved for years and years and years and years. And Leviticus is a story about these people coming out of slavery. Now, the story of people coming out of slavery and out of Egypt would really resonate with who? Another people in exile. And so when people are in Babylon wondering, how do we get here? How do we get home? And what do we do once we get home? These are the people that develop this book. And a really interesting thing about the structure of Leviticus is that the next story after the sacrificial system has been set up, it's the ordination of the priests. And the priests, two of Aaron's sons who are ordained as priests, have a particular job. And they decide instead of doing their own job, they're going to do their dad's job. And it results in their death. And it's another picture of exile. And so the Jewish people, as they're sitting in exile, are developing and remembering and thinking about these stories and putting them together in such a way that it gives them hope. And what's interesting about the book of Leviticus is that this kind of way that it was put together was done by people that had priestly concerns. They were from the priestly line. They were Levites. They were sons of Levi who was given the task of maintaining the tent of meeting, maintaining the temple when it became a temple, and maintaining ritual order. And so their answer to a lot of the questions of why we ended up in exile and how do we stay home once we get there is to maintain ritual order, to maintain purity, to make sure that the appropriate offerings are kept, and to make sure the appropriate seasons are observed, which is where we get all of our biblical festivals. And then also just the lists of ritual purity and impurity, and the lists of moral purity and impurity that people need to follow. And so for Micah, this is a long way to get around this. Micah was actually written closer to the time that Leviticus was actually put together than when Leviticus was set. And Micah is another reflection of the same kind of question of what are we doing? How do we get into a mess? How do we get out of a mess? And so Micah, one of the things that Micah asks is, if God is so angry at us, what is it that we can do to appease this God? Is God this angry at us? And so do I have to offer all of this stuff? And Leviticus is one of the ways that the priestly class answers that question.
And at that time, there is no sacrificial system, correct? The time of Micah.
In the exile, the sacrificial system has come to an end because the temple was destroyed. I mean, the sacrificial system existed pre-exile. I'm not saying that Leviticus was written as a brand new idea in the exile. But the way that Leviticus comes together is a story, is a historical retelling of the myths and traditions of the people of Israel to speak to the present circumstance of those people.
So the narrative of Leviticus seems like a step forward in human consciousness for the people of that era. And then the compilation of it is another example of a step forward in human consciousness, where we have a prophet, Micah, and others who seem to reinterpret the whole system around justice and mercy and compassion.
And even Leviticus does that. Some of those other prophets, you've got Hosea and Isaiah both saying that God says to them, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And so even while Leviticus begins with this system of offerings, what ends Leviticus is a list of laws that have to do with mercy. And if you look at Leviticus 19 in particular, which, spoiler alert, Jesus quotes, it is a list over and over and over again of how to offer mercy to the most vulnerable people in your society.
So these people aren't, or these prophets and Jesus also, are not rejecting Leviticus, they're deepening it.
I think so. And part of at the heart of that is this Day of Atonement. Because if sacrifice was the answer to everything, then the Day of Atonement should be something that answers everything. And the Day of Atonement should take care of everything. And yet you have to observe the Day of Atonement every year because things keep going wrong and wrong and wrong. And so the whole thing about Leviticus, and yes, I'm reading this from a lens that for me has Jesus kind of towards the end of this salvific narrative. Jesus reinterprets this atonement through his own life and death, and the people that followed him talk about his resurrection. And then you get to the writer of Hebrews, or the writer of Hebrews says that sacrifices were never the way that sin was taken away, and that it would never be a permanent answer. And then the writer of Hebrews then starts to talk about how Jesus really fulfills these things.
Chris, let me pivot and ask you a question.
Oh, no.
Because what I'm hearing from Ryan, it feels like at least one lens through which we could look at Leviticus is that it's giving people a structured way to repair a relationship when they feel that something has gone wrong. From your perspective as a person in recovery, do you see any connection between that and how folks might practice making amends today?
You're not just making amends, but the whole process. The pattern makes a lot of sense. In recovery, we don't erase the earlier stages of our lives. The 12 steps force us to reinterpret them, to look at them through a new lens. We don't shame the past. We learn from it, and we grow through it. And we carry forward what helped us survive and what helped us to begin to change. It's transcending and including. And if you look at all the steps, they're a path towards a spiritual awakening, which includes first coming to believe in a power greater than ourselves, and then making a decision to follow that path, and then to take a look at ourselves, an examination of consciousness. I'm sure you guys, what's the days of awe? What is it? Awe, the days of awe, yeah. And then confession, and then recognition of our defects of character or our survival traits, if you will, and then depending on God to help us either to remove them or to heal them or to integrate them, whatever those are, and then making amends to the people we've harmed. All of these things remove what has blocked me off from the sunlight of the Spirit, or actually the perception that I am blocked off from the sunlight of the Spirit.
Beautiful.
All right, Ryan, let me ask you this. Leviticus seems to return to the idea of holiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not as distance from, regular life, but as living inside God's presence. How do you understand holiness in that sense?
So the way that holiness is kind of described in this book, it really is about the being near to the divine. You might say that it's the folks that do the Bible Project videos. They define holiness in Leviticus as proximity to the divine, drawing near to that one that draws near. What holiness is the state, I guess, maybe you'd say, of adequate preparation to host the divine. I'm trying to think of an adequate kind of description of this, and the only thing that I can think of is this. Who's one of your favorite guitarists, Chris?
Chris Estes.
Darrell L. Smith.
Darrell L. Smith, Chris Estes, both excellent guitarists. Who is
John
the
Mayer.
Master of the John Mayer is a
John
master
Mayer.
of the craft. Okay. And so imagine that John Mayer is the god of guitar players, and you are drawing near to John Mayer. And one of the tasks that you have as a worshiper and follower of your God is that you must imitate your God. This is something that's a common refrain throughout Leviticus. Be holy as the Lord your God is holy. And so in your imitation of John Mayer, you are coming before John Mayer and playing your guitar. And every single little error that you make as you play for John Mayer is just blasting in your mind. And you are getting more and more humiliated and shamed by your inability to imitate John Mayer. That's kind of what this book is about. Is that we have somebody that this relationship with the divine being that is so good and so beautiful and so powerful and so creative and so graceful and so merciful and so loving and so forgiving that they can give you everything that they can give you to be in right relationship. And when you come near to that person, everything that you kind of are nervous about and everything that you've been ashamed about, anybody that's ever been in a shame spiral can probably hear this. Like, it starts shouting at you and you begin to feel completely inadequate. And what holiness is helping you to learn that you can draw near to this without having to worry about all of that, because the way that all of that can be repaired, the way that all of that can be purified in the language of Leviticus, the way that everything can be kind of smoothed over is actually given to you in the first place. None of that is actually separating you from this thing that you're trying to draw near.
Here's a question that the listeners might actually be interested in. Reading Leviticus through this transcendent include lens, what do we think this book is trying to teach us about living with God now?
One of the things that I think that I take from it, let me start with a confession. I struggle sometimes with Leviticus. And so it's really helpful for me to hear from you guys when you're saying transcend and include what helped us survive back then, but go further. And it helps me to hear it from you guys, but it also helps me to hear it from the Bible itself as it finds its voice in its own dialogue with Leviticus. A lot of times we rip parts of Leviticus out of the book and use them to disqualify others. Some of my least favorite book verses of the Bible can be found in Leviticus. Lots of clobber verses that we use to beat other people up and disqualify them. And the fact that we do that is just an antithesis, right? It's an oxymoron that we would take this book, this voice that is here to tell us, like Ryan said, you can draw near to the one who is drawing near. It's almost ridiculously poetic how connected you are to this God. But if you think you need these steps, God's going to give you those steps. And so we then take those steps and use them not as a reminder for ourselves that we are one, that we are drawing near to the one who draws near. We use them as disqualifiers and boundaries for others. And we say, hey, you haven't done this, or you did this thing wrong, or you didn't follow this rule, so you're not worthy.
Or we set them up as the thing we worship instead.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that feels like a very modern problem, but what I love is it's not. It's an ancient problem. And the Bible started calling that out in us as well. And so I look at this thing that we've talked about before. Richard Rohr, we paraphrase this, is quoted as saying something along the lines of the only thing that separates you from God is the idea that you are. And so whatever ideas that we put forth and say, this separates me from God, God moves right into that space and says, you think this separates you? It does not. And so we have this strange, I'm going to hum a few bars of the Leviticus 21 for you, right? Because this is one that I love where I see the Bible talking to itself. In Leviticus 21, it says, God spoke to Moses, tell Aaron, none of your descendants in any generation to come who has a defect of any kind may present as an offering the food of his God. That means anyone who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed, crippled in foot or hand, hunchbacked, or a dwarf, who has anything wrong with his eyes, who has leprosy, or is a eunuch. So it's a very specific list of people who cannot draw near to bring a food offering to God. And that's in Leviticus, right? And it's a problem. It is not a timeless truth. It is not something that we should stitch on a pillow and say the word of the Lord. It is a very specific instruction. And the Bible knows that because later on we get this writer named Luke, to whom we attribute the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And Luke takes that list and he makes sure that exact list in Luke and Acts that each one of the people that are named there, the blind, the lame, the disfigured, the deformed, the crippled in foot or hand, the hunchback, the dwarf, those who have problems with their eyes, those who have leprosy or are a eunuch, Jesus has a meal. Jesus interacts with each one of the people listed there. And that's not a historical coincidence. That is the Bible talking to the Bible and the people who are missing the point. It's saying, don't use this list to disqualify others. Remember, you draw near to the one who draws near anytime, anywhere. And so Even the Bible struggles with this, and the writers of the Bible struggle with this. So the fact that we're doing it today just means we're part of the family.
Who was the dwarf?
You tell me, Chris, because I have heard legend of the best sermon ever preached about that man. Who was he?
Zacchaeus.
There you go. He was a wee little man, or was he?
Ryan, what do you say when you hear this, that, well, that's all law. We're in a time of grace. We can just disregard that.
So that's an interesting question, because it really does kind of stand, sometimes it's a plumb line. These are the laws that people have to follow. But then if you try to hold me to this law, I'm going to say that I'm under grace. And so that's just a tool used to manipulate the scripture to begin with. But again, I want to say that law, the understanding of Leviticus as law and the understanding of Torah as law misunderstands the whole thing to begin with. Once again, Torah is not a list of commandments. Torah is not a list of requirements. Torah is not a list of laws. Torah is a narrative. And Leviticus happens to contain a lot of laws, but all of those laws are contained within a story. And that story is a story of liberation and grace and love. It's a story of how we end up harming our relationships with God, our relationships with each other, our relationships with the land, and what happens as a result of that harm, and the very real ways that God actually gives us to be liberated from that harm, and the ways of restitution and reconciliation that God gives us. And so what this story is that contains laws, the way that I understand the laws that are contained within the story, is that these laws are given to a people that have been enslaved. And these laws are given to them to teach them what it means to be free. And so when you're given a law that's teaching you how to be free, it's not something that you need to be rebound to. It is the thing that is giving you freedom and giving you the means to understand your freedom. And then it's what these laws within this narrative are saying. When you are free, and in this particular case, when you are atoned, when you are at one with God, and when you are at one with each other, and when you are at one with the land, these are the ways to behave to make sure that you do not harm your neighbor. These are the ways you behave to make sure that you do not harm your God. These are the ways that you behave to make sure that you're taking care of the land and that you're not exploiting it. These are the ways that you behave even to take care of your livestock and your animals, because we want to make sure that everything that God has created and loved is taken care of well. And when you find your liberation and you ask the question, what do I do when I found this liberation? The answer is liberate everything else. And that's what this story is telling us.
Yeah, I love what Ryan's pointing out there, because like Paul says this too in Galatians 3, when he's talking about the law, he refers to it, depending on your translation, it might say tutor, it might say schoolmaster, but the Greek word that's used there is the same root that we get the word for like pedagogue or pedagogical, like it's teaching. And that's what Ryan's helping us remember. Like the law is not a static moment in time, a static bar against which everyone, everywhere, in all times and places will be measured. It's a tutor. It's a teacher that comes to you where you are and helps you take the next step. It helps you progress. And so when Ryan says you don't then go back and measure yourself against that tutor, henceforth you keep going. And so the Bible keeps going. We've kept going. So for us to return back to the tutor of Leviticus, that was a specific tutor for a specific time and place and a specific group of people, and measure others against it is completely missing the point.
Ryan, how does Leviticus find its way into your daily life?
Leviticus finds its way into my daily life because whether we know it or not, and whether we like to admit it or not, we interpret the world and we interpret the Bible and we interpret our faith through a selective lens. And each of our lenses looks a little bit different. And, sometimes we emphasize certain things. And sometimes holiness for one of us means one thing and holiness for another means something else. But the way that Leviticus has kind of implanted itself in my mind is through a quote from Jesus. When Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? He answers with two different commandments. He first mentions from Deuteronomy 6, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then he says the second commandment is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I keep coming back to this idea that this Leviticus is always a response and a building on the story of the exile that begins with the story of Adam and Eve, and then keeps building on the ways that we harm relationships with one another. One of the most important things about the creation story is that people were created in the image of God. And so when you harm another person, when you harm a neighbor, you are also doing harm to the image of God within them and doing harm to the God that created them. And so one of the ways that this works out for me is that I try to see the world and I try to see the scriptures and I try to see my faith through the lens of loving of neighbor. And so this idea of the love of neighbor as myself is something that I think about and say and pray constantly. And so Leviticus has had a deep impact on the way that I live out my faith.
All right, guys, I guess we'll wrap it up right here. So what I've gotten out of this, guys, today is that Leviticus is where people first began learning that they could draw near to God. And we keep learning that same thing to this day. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. And if you're waiting on the world to change, I hope that we have helped you see Leviticus in a new light, and that perhaps the gravity of this conversation will make you realize you're going to live forever in me.
Amen.
Is that a John Mayer thing?
Those 5 John Mayer hits stringed together in one sentence.
Oh, my goodness.
You're welcome.
Fellas, do you have any book recommendations?
Anything besides John Mayer? Mine's not a book. How about it's like a 1.5 or 2 minute clip. If you Google search The West Wing and Leviticus, there is a scene from the show The West Wing that is just marvelous and has a lot to do with Leviticus.
Indeed. Thank you, Aaron Sorkin. If you have listened to this podcast and you are still conscious and you are thinking, man, I am digging this, I would love to learn more about the intricacies of the book of Leviticus, then check out The Hidden Order of Intimacy, Reflections on the Book of Leviticus by Avivah Gottlieb Zorneberg.
All right, write this down. Go online and find Dead & Company, July 8th, 2023 at the Gorge. Listen to St. Stephen's, which was in the second set, and listen to John Mayer's solo. It's fire.
Is it divine?
It's fire.
Okay, one last song reference is John Craigie live singing Talkin Leviticus Blues. You can find that on all your streaming platforms. Talkin Leviticus Blues by John Craigie.
Beautiful. Thank you for listening, everybody. And if you have any questions or comments, send them on, and maybe we'll tackle them on another episode. And until then, may your eyes be filled with wonders, your heart full of joy, your footsteps firm as you walk with God, and may your light become your voice. Thanks, everybody.
Peace.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Common Space. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to this show so you don't miss a single episode. If you have a faith-related question you'd like to submit to the show for the chance of it being featured on a future episode, visit ahumc.org/questions to submit. That's ahumc.org/questions. If you'd like to contact the podcast team, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.
Oh, Leviticus, Leviticus. You in the Bible, so they take you serious. Are you too old? Are you still relevant? Oh, my sweet Leviticus.